Well, today's lecture is all about a topic that we've discussed a few times already in the course, but more formal in this particular lecture. We're going to talk about the neurology of language, and in particular we're going to focus on a condition that is referred to as aphasia. We've actually used the term aphasia before in a number of ways to describe different localization sites for speech production, speech comprehension and repetition and so on. So we've used the term many times, but we haven't dug deep into the term and what it means for a speech therapist. So that's what the goal for today's lecture is going to be. Now, to begin with, we need to have a good overview of what it means to define language, and this is not a straightforward task. But of course it is the distinctive feature of humans as a species. So, in human species we all have the capacity to speak and also to comprehend a language that we are familiar with, the so-called native language. That's the language that we are born into, native language. Interesting fact that children, when they're born as first neonates, can understand the phonemes of every single language in the world. They can respond to phoneme sounds that come from Zulu as much as they do from Cantonese or English. But after around 6 to 9 months, the child no longer responds to those phonemes that are in other languages that are non-native. So they begin to discriminate between the Zulu sounds and the Cantonese sounds at around this age and just focus on the Cantonese sounds. We call that process habituation, which means that the speech comprehension system is ignoring those items that are not reinforced in the language environment, such as Zulu, and focusing instead on those phonemes that they hear frequently in Cantonese or perhaps in English. So when we think about humans and language, we note that it's a fairly special skill. It's specialized in ways that linguists define according to specific criteria. Actually, there's a lot of different criteria that one could use, but fundamentally, the types of linguistic constructs that define a human language are whether there are these components. One is the content of the language. So this refers to the conceptual processes. So we can all understand words that are representing a concept that we know. And this is not different necessarily to other species. So in the case of a chimp, we could present a token, say a blue chip, and we could pair it with a banana. We all know chimps love bananas. And then we could observe that the chimp could learn that the blue chip actually stands for or represents a banana. And actually we can observe that chimps would begin to learn how to use the token to ask for a banana. So this is a form of referentiality that the linguists like to talk about, which is not unique to humans, but the content of human language is definitely more sophisticated. We don't use colors to represent an object. We have a much richer content to the language for representing the concepts that we know. And furthermore, the content of a human language is generative, which means that it has the quality of producing new content that is not known in the language previously. So we're always hearing new words invented in every language. For example, the word text. So text used to be a very, very low frequency word. Actually, it only referred to books, and only scholars really ever use the word text. But in the last 20 years, the word text has become one of the highest frequency words in English language, and it's actually translated into other languages too. Text has become a very popular word because of the revolution in digital technology. So we can generate new words, we can enliven or bring from the dead words that are were very uncommon, and that makes the generative capacity of the human language very unique. Form is the other component of language, and here our languages, human languages, are certainly very unique compared to others that are used by a primate. So we imagine that the form of language that other species might use would include all kinds of phenomena that we also use. So vocalizations such as grunts. So even deer and bear and elephants will grunt and use vocalizations to communicate with each other. So that form is something that we see in a lot of different species. The form of communication can be quite shared amongst species on the planet, living creatures. But again, the form of human language is much richer. So we've got in most human languages a phenomenon called grammar, which is a very, very useful algorithm or learning device, a rule-based system. So the rule-based system for each language is often very unique. So the rules used to produce Cantonese grammar are completely different to the rules used to produce English grammar, for example. So there's nothing fixed about grammar necessarily. It's very fluid. But the trick with grammar is that it's able to generate new utterances and novelty from a small set of rules. And we see that in human languages, the capacity of grammar to be generative is very remarkable. So we can write huge amounts of novel material like poetry or new texts, books, ideas through the use of grammatical structures that are the form of the language. Sometimes this form of human language is referred to as syntax. Now, if we go back to the chimps and the blue banana token, we actually can teach a chimp how to use two chips, maybe a blue chip and a red chip. So the blue is the banana, and the red is a token to stand for want or desire. So get, or maybe give, or pass, or get. So let's call it want. So the content word for the blue chip is the banana, for the red is want or desire. And we can actually train a chimp to use these two different chips together to express the form I want a banana, so that they can use a kind of syntax to do that. But caveat emptor here, there is a huge amount of training required to do that with a chimp. It's not something that happens spontaneously. It's not something that happens generatively. It's really more of a stimulus-response association that we see in the chimp compared to the human. And finally, language use. And again, we see a difference with humans and other languages. Human language has a very sophisticated use. We can use it for a number of different purposes. So we can speak, we can write, we can therefore read. So literacy is a relatively new phenomenon in human species, but we have observed literacy in many cultures around the world develop about 5,000 years ago. And literacy is a use for language that is unique. No other creature does that. Rats don't write. If we take a look at the use of other forms of language, so let's say gesture or vocalization. Now, there are certainly some very sophisticated vocalizations that we observe in the animal kingdom. So a red deer will use a very sophisticated call to let the female deer know that he's ready to mate. And these vocalizations have a quality that's very unique, very distinctive, very rarely produced, but when it's produced, that means the call to mate. So this is a sophisticated adaptation device in red deer. Same with gesture. Obviously chimps can gesture, and they can make their meaning clear through gesture. But we use gesture in a huge range of ways that chimps never do. So gesture we use includes the face, which chimps don't do much. It includes the eyes. Chimps don't really use their eyes much in communication. And same with vocalization. So yeah, the red deer's vocalizations are very useful and distinctive, but we change our vocalization all the time. We use different stress, we do use different intonation. So the use of language for humans is much, much more sophisticated than it is for other species.